We'll sing the same song, just a little different. Jesus saves. We have heard the joyful sound. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Spread the tidings all around. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Bear the news to every land. Climb the steeps and cross the waves. Onward 'tis our Lord's command. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Give the winds a mighty voice. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Let the nations now rejoice. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Shout salvation full and free. Highest hills and deepest caves. This our song of victory. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. You may be seated.
Well, good evening. I hope you've had a good day today. It's been a good day for me, and I hope that it has been for you. I really enjoyed this morning. How many of you enjoyed this morning? Well, I had folks after the service tell me what a wonderful, wonderful time they had, and then they said this, and I don't know if it was sarcastic or if they just, maybe were not quite as precise as they needed to be with their words, but they said, "We really enjoyed your message this morning." And I'm thinking, I didn't have a message this morning. And so, did they enjoy the service, or did they enjoy not hearing a message this morning? So I hadn't quite figured that out. I've been working on it all afternoon, but I appreciate you being back tonight. And I was telling the choir, looks like we've got an ensemble tonight instead of a choir. So evidently some choir members decided that they didn't need to come back, but I appreciate those that did. And I'm looking forward to spending a little time with you in the book of Daniel tonight. I do want you to pray for Lavette Anderson's family. Miss Lavette a couple of days ago had a massive stroke. There is no brain activity right now, and in the morning they will probably make a decision about her. I want you to pray for her family. She's got a son named Lionel, and I hope that you will pray for Lionel and the rest of the family. I think she's got a brother that is probably going to try to come in from out of town. So please pray for Miss Lavette's family. And then I want you to keep praying for Brother Bobby Dempsey. Bobby was one of our longtime Sunday school teachers and deacons here at the church, lives down in Ocala, Florida now, and he is battling blood cancer. And I want you to lift him up in your prayers. Bobby's a good man. He loves the Lord. And he was really one of the best Bible teachers we ever had at this church. He studied and he loved his Bible. And I want you to pray for him. And while you're praying for him, make sure that you whisper a prayer for Miss Carolyn as well. Is it tomorrow, Chad? You guys are going to Six Flags? All right, I want you to pray for our young people as they go to Six Flags tomorrow. First of all, pray that they will have mercy as they drive out there and back. And then also pray that they'll be safe as they are there at the park. I know it's been years since I've been to Six Flags, and I hope it's many more before I go back. I got tired of having to go out and ride the Scream Machine. But anyway, you pray for our young people. We had a good turnout at our house yesterday with some of the ladies in the ladies' Bible class. It was a good day. I know Deb's got another group of folks coming to the house sometime in December. And so a lot of things going on, a lot of moving parts, but we need your prayers for all of those things. And it sure was a blessing to see the Lord move this morning with folks coming to the altar and folks joining the church. And so I hope that you'll keep praying for the church, pray for the ministries of the church, but especially you pray for Bobby and Miss Lavette, okay? Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much for the privilege of being at church tonight. Lord, a lot of folks, they wish they could be, but they just couldn't. And I pray that tonight would be a good night for them. I pray for those that are watching by way of the internet. I pray that you'd give them a blessing. but especially bless those that have made an effort to come back to God's house on a Sunday evening. I pray that tonight as we open up the book of Daniel, that it would be just a few more verses that would add to our knowledge of the Scriptures, and that it would stir our souls, knowing that what we're talking about is soon to come to pass. So I pray tonight that you'd be honored with what we try to do. I pray that you'd bless Levette's family and Bobby's family. In Jesus' name, amen.
Blessed be the name. All praise to Him who's above in majesty supreme, who gave His Son for man to die, that He might man redeem. Blessed be the name, blessed be the name, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be the name, blessed be the name, blessed be the name I sit and ponder the glory that waits for me. There's joy in knowing to heaven I'm going to live for eternity. One day I'll finally see heaven, heaven. That's where I long to be. Loved ones are waiting, I'm anticipating to see them once again. There'll be no more dying and no more crying when we reach heaven's land. Heaven, heaven. One day I'll finally see heaven, heaven. That's where I long to be.
Let me add one prayer request. Just had my Dick Tracy phone go off, and I looked at it, and it was a little message from Martha. Daryl took a fall this afternoon, and we need to pray for Daryl. He'll do well for a while, and then he'll try to do something like most of us, not think. And so somehow he fell, and so Martha had to keep him home tonight. Last time we talked about the rise of Alexander the Great. We talked about how fast Alexander conquered. The descriptions that Greece had in the book of Daniel, it had to do with the leopard and the wings, and how that it was as though the speed was barely touching the ground. Then you had the he-goat that came against the ram and basically destroyed the ram. But then that he-goat, when he was at the zenith of his power, was cut down. He died. And what we know about that is that Alexander the Great died when he was really early 30s. I think there's a discrepancy. Some people say he died when he was 31. Some say he died when he was 33. I don't know if anybody really knows dogmatically, but they do know that he died early. And when I think about Alexander the Great, he was one of those guys that he did not want to destroy just any and everybody. He only destroyed to make a point, excuse me, so that others, it's like I just got a tickle. He would destroy, say, the Persians, and he would just annihilate them so that everybody else could see. And if they were willing to submit, then he was willing to grant mercy to that group of people. The ones that extended that would have been the Romans. Alexander had one great desire, that everybody in the known world be under one common language. I believe that part of Alexander's rise was because God was setting the table. He was setting the table for Christ to come. And when the New Testament period began, the majority of the New Testament was written in Greek. It is pronounced koine. It's K-O-I-N-E, koine, Greek, which means common. And so everybody was under a common language. And that was Alexander's desire. Now, there's some great things that when Alexander the Great took over the known world, he stopped the Eastern powers, a.k.a. Persia, from influencing the West, and everybody beginning to be underneath a Eastern mindset, because Alexander was Western in its mindset. You could say that many of the things that Alexander did when he conquered was to set some of the foundations for what we know as Western civilization. And so you've got Alexander, and he died as a young man, but yet he had these goals in place where that everybody would speak the same language and that they would be under the same culture. When he died, that kingdom was split into 4 sections. The first section, the European section, was, thank you, Brother Dave, I appreciate you bringing me that water, was under a man named Cassander. That was one of his generals. Then the second one was Asia Minor, which we know as modern Turkey. Thank you, sir. Modern Turkey. And then the third one was one that we will talk more about tonight. And his name was Seleucus. And he was the one that was in the eastern portion of the empire, which we know as Syria today. And then the last one was down in the south, and that was Ptolemy, spelled with a P. That would be under, say, Egypt and North Africa. And so tonight we're going to look at what had taken place. If you look back at verse number 8, that'll be our background, and then we will kick off in verse number 9 tonight. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. In other words, Alexander died. For it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And that's the 4 generals that I just referenced a second ago. Now tonight, I want you to notice the arrival of a man that we call Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus the 4th. Now, Antiochus was, he was a godless man, as far as the God of the Bible goes anyway. He was a religious man, but he was a man that did not care for the God of the Bible. And so the first thing that I want us to look at is his arrival tonight in verse number 9 and in verse number 10. It says, and out of one of them came forth a little horn. Do you remember when we were looking in Daniel chapter 7, the phrase little horn? Well, there's some people, when they read that, and I probably have been guilty of it in myself, 30 years ago. I was just, not very deep in the Lord, and I would read about the little horn, and I would make the assumption that that is the exact same person. But if you really began to lay out chapter 7 and chapter 8, you find that they are not the same person. If you were to look at chapter 7, what you find is, you find that the little horn of chapter 7 came out of the Roman Empire. There were 10 horns, and that little horn came out of the Roman Empire. Well, here in chapter 8, verse number 9, it talked about out of one of them. Well, what is the them a reference to? To the 4 horns in verse number 8, one verse previously. Well, what are those 4 horns from? They are from the one great horn, which was Alexander the Great, which is Greece, not Rome. So we see that the little horn of chapter 7 is Roman, the little horn of chapter 8 is Greek. Not only that, in chapter 7, the little horn comes from 10. In chapter 8, the little horn comes out of 4. And then also in chapter 7, you remember the descriptions that were given. The 4th was a beast, but it did not give us a like unto. It was not a like unto a lion or a like unto a leopard or a like unto a bear, anything like that. It was just a beast. And then in this chapter, in chapter 8, the little horn, it comes from a kingdom or one of the kings. And so I do not believe that when he arrives that he is going to come out of the same place that chapter 7 says the little horn comes from. Now, why does that matter? Well, because in chapter 7, we talked about that being a type of the Antichrist. Well, do I believe that chapter 8 can also be a type of the Antichrist? I do. But one of the things that you've got to remember when you're doing types is that if you do a type, you can't always take that to a maximum conclusion. In other words, there's maybe similarities here, similarities there, but you can't be dogmatic that every single thing that one person did is what the future person is going to do. Now, I think that in Daniel chapter 8, the things that this man is going to do that I will mention tonight, I think that it's exactly the same thing that the Antichrist is going to do during the tribulation period. But just because I think that they are similar in their acts, I do not think that these 2 men, or these 2 horns, if you'd rather use that term, in chapters 7 and 8 are identical. And so we see in verse number 9, and one of them came forth a little horn, and what did he do? He waxed exceeding great. And how did he do that? He did that toward the south. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that if you took a map and geographically you went south, what would you do? You would run into Egypt and North Africa. And so you've got this Seleucid king out of the Seleucid dynasty. You've got that king, and now what is he doing? He's trying to wax great against these other 3 kingdoms that had been split when Alexander died. And history tells us that the Ptolemy king, he was scared of the Seleucid king, Antiochus Epiphanes. And because of that, he fled. And then Antiochus Epiphanes was able to basically plunder Egypt. He was able to take spoils from Egypt. And what did he do? Then he turned east. And then he turned toward the pleasant land. Now, what do we know the pleasant land to be? Well, most commentators, and myself included, we think that it has to do with the nation of Israel. Now, why do I think that? I think that because the Bible talks about the promised land being a land filled with milk and honey. And I think that even today, I think that the blessings of God can be seen on the nation of Israel in ways that other nations there can't even fathom. I was telling someone this week that Israel seems to be so far ahead of us intellectually that that is just it's an astounding thing to me. The Mediterranean Sea is not one of the largest seas. I don't even know if it's in the top 3. I don't think that it is. But the Mediterranean Sea is no less a great, huge body of water. The Middle East has had to ration water literally for its whole existence. Only a few places has really even Israel had flourishing amounts of water. Down in the Negev, which is the southern part of Israel, there's a place called En-Gedi, and there is a spring that is known as David Springs, because that's where he and his men would hide when Saul had been chasing them, when David was on the run, running from about 3,000 of Saul's men. But that is the one place that has water. The only other options that they had for many, many years, the Sea of Galilee. It would begin way up in the north, and some of those little small tributaries up around the northern Galilee, up around Caesarea Philippi, and they would begin to all come together, and they would finally come into the Jordan River, and they would go into the Sea of Galilee. And at one time, about 70% of all of Israel's fresh water came from the Sea of Galilee. But they developed a technology. And now, according to an article that I read just less than 6 months ago, Israel now has what is called desalination plants. And what they do is they take the water out of the Mediterranean Sea, they run it through the desalination plants, and then they pump it to all parts of that country. I don't understand why California doesn't do that. I absolutely don't understand, other than the fact that it's run by lunatics. You've got the Pacific Ocean, which is the largest body of water. It's not even close. The Pacific Ocean, there could be a desalination plant, and those California farmers that grow all of those fruits and vegetables, they could have as much irrigation as they needed, but yet California's government, because of California's people, will not build one of those plants. Israel is not under a drought the way that they used to be. Now, because they were under a drought, they had to develop technologies. And there is nobody that has a greater drip technology than Israel does. You can look and you can see orchards, and you can see hot houses that have been built all through that nation. And they would take some of that brackish water that could not be used for human consumption, but what they would do is they would take and they would experiment, and they would begin to drop it just drip by drip by drip by drip on these orchards, and all of a sudden they found out that those trees responded to that water that had a little bit, just a small, minute bit of salt in it. And so they have just developed over the years. And so it is called the pleasant land. And you know why I think that God chose that is because it was the least of all the people. It was a small group of people, and God said, I'm going to show the world how great I will be by blessing this insignificant group of people. And that's what God's done. God specializes in taking weak things and insignificant things and weak people and insignificant people and doing something mighty with them. And so you've got Antiochus, and what is he doing? He is going toward the pleasant land. And so you look at verse number 10, it says, and it, talking about the horn, waxed great. In other words, he was getting stronger and stronger. He had more military, and he had more finances because of the conquerings in Egypt and because of the conquerings in the east. And now he has set his eyes on the pleasant land. And it says, the horn waxed great, even to the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Now there's a difference in opinion about the host and the stars that are mentioned here in verse number 10. When I look at this, I look at this and I think, well, who could they be? Because there's good people on all sides that have different opinions. I happen to think that the host is the nation of Israel and that the stars are the godly leaders. Now, don't for a minute think that when I say that I'm talking about the whole nation. I think that there is a remnant. There's going to be a transgression that we'll talk about in a moment that I think are maybe is attributed to them. But there were some people. And these people were going to do their best to try to stand for right. And so you've got this host and the stars, and this horn cast those down to the ground and stamped upon them. I mean, just stomped them to pieces. And Antiochus Epiphanes was one of those men that wanted to let everybody know that he was the strong man. He wanted to give everybody a heads up, don't mess with me. And so that's the arrival that we see. Now, as far as other people's opinion about the host, there's some people, because when the Lord is called the Lord of hosts, they take that to mean that it is a reference to angels. It may very well be that during this time there was some type of war in the angelic realm. But I don't think that when we read this that we need to think that, even though there's some good men like J. Vernon McGee that he alludes to it. He said it very well could be that part of this great war, when the host and the stars were stamped, that it could have to do partially with the angelic realm. I don't think it needs to say that. If you want to hold to that, I think that's okay. I just do not hold to it. I just think that the host and the stars are probably a remnant of godly Jews and the leaders that they are trying to follow. So the first thing we see is his arrival. But then I want you to notice his ascending. His ascending. Look with me at verse 11. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. In other words, he was standing up even against God Almighty, because God is the prince of the host. He is the one that has the authority over the host, whether it be a human host or an angelic host. And it says, and by him, talking about the horn, the daily sacrifice was taken away. So what was taking place in the pleasant land? Well, you had those people that they were under the authority of Alexander the Great. but he had given them such a freedom that they could worship God as they chose to. And how did they choose to? They chose to do it the Old Testament way, by offering daily sacrifices. Somebody may not have been able to come, say, on a Sabbath day, and maybe they were traveling, but they wanted to offer a sacrifice. And so they would go and they would have a priest, and he would take that animal and he would kill it, and he would offer the sacrifice on their behalf. And so the daily sacrifice was taken away. So what do we know about this man's ascension? Well, the name Epiphanes is a title that he gave to himself. And what it means is that God is manifested in the person to whom that name is attributed. He was a follower of the Greek gods on Mount Olympus. And one of the gods that he felt he may have been a reincarnation of was the god Jupiter. Hence, we have Jupiter as one of the planets in our solar system. And so he gave himself this grand name until he took upon the name Epiphanes, God manifested. He was simply known as Antiochus the Fourth, which is Antiochus was considered to be the great. So the first one would have been Antiochus the Great. Then there would have been a 2 or 3. And now he is the 4. And so he takes upon himself another moniker, Epiphanes, because he wants everybody to know he is distinguished from the last 2. All right? And so God, though, has allowed him to ascend. Now, why do I think that? Well, I think that because of something that is said in verse number 12. In verse number 12, it talks about, "And host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression." But whose transgression are we talking about? Was it the transgression of Antiochus? Or was it the transgression of God's people? Well, I would simply submit that it could be either or both. First of all, Antiochus was a pagan man, which means that he was a godless man. Secular history tells us that he was a man that could be brutal. Now, he was probably not the most brutal emperor or king that ever lived, but he is certainly a type of the Antichrist. You're going to have literally tens of thousands, if not yea, millions of people that are martyred during the time of the tribulation period. But you've got this man, and are the transgressions his transgressions? Well, we know from verse number 11 and then verse number 12 that he stopped the daily sacrifice. How did he do that? Well, it tells us in, again, secular history. And by the way, there is a book that I've had for years, and one of our sweet ladies, she wanted to know if I had anything that was during what is called the intertestament period, which means the period between the Old and the New Testament. And one of the best books that you can ever get and read is by Harry Ironside, called The 400 Silent Years. It is an easy read. It's not detailed so much that you're going to get lost in a fog. The writings, at least in the little book that I've got, are pretty big, so that helps me out a lot. And so I recommended that book, and she's been reading this, and I whispered to her as she was getting ready to leave the choir, I said, that book is kind of what we're covering tonight as far as the same time period. Because you see, Malachi is the last Old Testament book, and that was written around 400 BC. Matthew is the first New Testament book, and so was God speaking during those 400 years? Well, he was not speaking as far as giving a written word, but the unseen hand of God can be seen everywhere in this secular history and in this sacred history and in our personal lives. We can see God working in our lives. At least if you're looking, you can see that. And so you've got this man, and he has ceased the daily sacrifice. He went so far to desecrate the temple of God as to do this. He took a sow, and he cut that sow's throat and took the sow's blood, pig's blood, and spread it all over the ark of God, the furniture there in the temple, and basically he made it an unholy place. Well, how long did that last? We'll get to that in a moment. But it was one of those things where he was hated by the genuine Orthodox people of God because of his desecration of the house of God. And so we see that was a transgression. But is that the only transgression? There have been all kinds of people throughout all history that have had terrible transgressions against God and against the people of God. But was not God concerned about his own people's sin? Sure. When you go through the Old Testament, what do you find? You find that Moses led people out of bondage, led them headed toward the promised land, which should have been an 11-day journey, and it took them 40 years to get there. And the generation that left Egypt did not even get to go into the promised land because of their sinfulness and their disobedience. What about when you get to the book of Judges? What do you see? They are in bondage again. And they're crying out to God. And God hears their prayers. And God sends a deliverer. Somebody like Gideon. Somebody like Jephthah. Somebody like Samson. All of those judges, they were saviors. They were deliverers. And those people, they were delivered. And then all of a sudden they began to sin again. And what did God do? God let them go back into captivity. And so what do you have here during this particular time? Now Antiochus, he was the emperor from about, I think it was like 173 to maybe 163 BC. He was only on the throne for about 11 years. And so you've got this man, and during that 11 years, as he began to wax great, what does that intertestament period of history tell us? Well, there are what is called the apocryphal books. That are the books that are between the Old and the New Testament that are in the Catholic Bible. Now, those books have never been accepted as being the inspired Word of God. We don't accept them as being the inspired Word of God. But one thing that a lot of commentators do accept is that most of the history that you read in books such as the Maccabees, that it is accurate historically. And so you've got this group of people, and in the book of the Maccabees, it talks about a certain number of Jews that had collaborated with Antiochus Epiphanes to overthrow Jerusalem. They had gone so far as to take certain scrolls and certain copies of the law and destroy it. Why? Because they were going to let Antiochus influence the Jews in Israel, in that pleasant land, so that they could become basically Greeks. And yet you had a certain number of people that began to fight against that. And so is the transgression that the passage here in verse number 12 tells us, is it the transgression of Antiochus or is it the transgression of Israel? It's probably both. Because God judges sin, whether it be for the ungodly or those that would even claim the name of Christ. That gets us into a whole different realm there. Everybody that names the name of God isn't a saint. All right? And so we see that there is an ascending, and we don't know who the transgression is. It's probably both. But yet, the result of that the horn cast down the truth. There's a saying that goes around some these days. It says that a lie will be halfway around the world before the truth gets her shoes on. And I think that's so. How many of you have heard something on a newscast? And 2 months later you find out that there was nothing on that newscast that was accurate. Hey, I hadn't got time to give you 4 or 5 illustrations of that. And you got people, and whenever the truth finally comes out, well, I never said that. But they've got it on tape saying exactly that. And so you've got truth being cast down. I think of the news media when I think of that. And it says, and what happened? And the horn, he practiced what he was doing and he prospered. Do you know there comes a time when God will let evil flourish? I think that the Antichrist, which again, this little horn in chapter 8 is a type of the Antichrist. He's just not the same little horn that was in chapter 7. But the Antichrist in the book of the Revelation, he is going to be prosperous for a while. But then the last thing that I want you to see tonight is I want you to see the angel's announcement. Look with me at verse 13. Then I, which is Daniel, heard one saint. Now the word saint there simply means a holy one. And it says, and I heard one holy one speaking, and another holy one said unto that certain holy one which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? So you've got Daniel, and he hears 2 angels talking. These angels are observing what's happening. One of them understands, one of them does not understand. The one that has a lack of understanding asks the other, and he says, how long are these daily sacrifices going to be halted? How long is the transgression of desolation going to last? That transgression of desolation, I believe that to be the same, again, the type of what is called the abomination of desolation spoken of in the New Testament. And so you've got this transgression of desolation, and then how long to give both the sanctuary, both that holy place, and the host, the godly Israelites, to be trodden underfoot. So that's a question. Is that not something that God's people have asked for millennia? I mean, we have asked when we see the godless seem to flourish and the godly seem to suffer. David saw that in his day, 1000 BC. And you and I see that in 2022. We see godless people and they seem to have everything going their way, and we just think, Lord, what are you doing here? But yet God knows exactly what he's doing. He just hasn't chosen to let us in on it. But he's a God that can be trusted. And so we see this conversation that takes place. And then the angel with the knowledge, what did he say? He said unto me, talking about Daniel, he said, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So, when you see that, is that number. There's people that misinterpret numbers. And one of the things that you've got to be very careful about is what is called numerology, where that you can begin to find all kind of things that are hidden meanings. Remember this, the Bible says that there is no prophecy of a private interpretation. In other words, you're not the first person in the history of Christianity to really have the correct interpretation of a certain passage. When you begin to think that you're the only one that's got it, all of a sudden you're bordering really on being unorthodox. And that's what the ancient Gnostics did. They said, oh, we've got a spiritual knowledge that you can't get. We're on a higher plane that you maybe cannot attain to because you are not one of us. And basically what it is, it's a form of narcissism where that you think you're better than everybody else. And yet you've got some people and they go, oh, I've got the answer to that. How many of you know who William Miller is? Anybody know William Miller? How many of you know who the Seventh-day Adventists are? All right? Most everybody's heard that. One of the most famous good men, conservative man, Ben Carson. You know, he's on the political scene. He's Seventh-day Adventist. They believe that you've got to keep the law, though, to be saved, and that includes especially the Sabbath day. Well, William Miller was not a Seventh-day Adventist, but his teachings were the foundation for Seventh-day Adventism. You see, Advent has the idea of the Lord's coming. And William Miller, he was a Baptist preacher. He wanted so much for the Lord to come that he began to take numbers. And he took this number. And he began to throw it into the Jewish calendar, and he began to do all of these numerical machinations, and he came up with a date. And it was, and I hope I'm remembering this right, I think it was might have been 1883. So 1843, 1883. Don't hold me to the date though, all right? I can find it for you, but don't hold me to that specific date. And he said, this is the year that Jesus is coming. And you know what happened? He didn't show up. I miscalculated. It's next year. And you know what happened? He didn't come. And so he began really to kind of get discouraged. And all I'm thinking is, if you're a Baptist preacher, surely you know that no man knows the day or the hour except the Father in heaven. I mean, how come you just can't accept that statement at face value? Then, later on, you had Ellen G. White. I think it's Ellen G. White. I didn't put these in my notes. I'm just doing this from memory tonight. She began to take his writings, and she's the one that began to write, and it became known as Seventh-day Adventism. And so they would talk about this number and that number, and at the end of his life, he said, I am sorry that they took my writings and my beliefs and have done this with them. he is credited with being, the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist, but he was never happy about that title. You got to be careful with numbers. Now, there's some people that take that number, that 2,300 number, and they'll divide it in half, and they'll do all kind of things with it that way, and it'll be, be 1,150 times 2, which is the evening and the morning of the daily, of the particular day. I simply take it to just mean really what it says, 2,300 days, and then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So what do we know? Well, we know that on a certain day in the mid-160s BC, that there was a man named Judas Maccabees. Some people call him Judah Maccabees. But Judah Maccabees, he was a fighter. And they were able to revolt, and there was rebellion, and they were successful. And he led those people to cleanse the temple. They rebuilt the furniture there in the temple of God. They began to do the sacrifice once again. And if you were to take 2,300 days from the time that Judah Maccabees did that, and you back up, it is in the heyday of Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. And so the announcement from the angels is that there's going to be 2,300 days, and that's how long that is going to last. But then the sacrifices will begin again because the temple will have been cleansed. And so you can read all about the history of this period in Antiochus Epiphanes in Harry Ironside's book, The 400 Silent Years. And so we see Antiochus, a type of the Antichrist, not the same little horn that's in chapter 7, but he's certainly a type of the Antichrist that we see in the book of the Revelation. We won't go to it tonight. We've been to it a couple of times already. But in Thessalonians, it talks about that he goes into the temple and pronounces himself to be God, and that he makes people give him worship. And that's what Antiochus wanted, and that's why he said, I am Epiphanes. I am the magnificent God. I am Jupiter reincarnated. And he sought the praise and the worship of God. But tonight, Antiochus Epiphanes is in hell. That's where he's at tonight. And that's where he will be until the great white throne judgment. And then he'll be moved out of the county jail into the permanent penitentiary that we call the lake of fire. Let's stand together. I thank you so much for being here tonight. Musicians are coming to the instruments. We'll have a verse of invitation. And if you need to come and pray, you come and pray. If you need somebody to talk to, we've got people that can take their Bible and show you what the Scriptures say about whatever problem you have. So as musicians play, if you need to come, you come on this first verse. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. What a wonderful song. Well, that's sufficient. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I still need a couple of folks to help rub some turkeys on Tuesday. So if you can help me with that, if you would let me know, I sure would appreciate it. I'd hate to have to rub 21 turkeys all by my lonesome. So anyway, I hope that you'll help me out with that if you possibly can. Check your bulletin for the announcements. We'll plan on seeing you on Wednesday. I plan on seeing you on Tuesday this week. So we'll have a midweek service, not Wednesday this week, but Tuesday. And remember, there is no Awana, but there will be a youth meeting. All right, that's this coming Tuesday. God bless you. Be careful going home.